C.S.Lewis A Biography by A.N.Wilson. Rights of copying go to A.N.Wilson. This recording is under fair use and it is educational and for public growth. Preface. The Quest for a Wardrobe. A child pushed open the door of the wardrobe so as to hide in it. It was, however, no ordinary wardrobe. It was hung with fur coats. The child pressed on, further through the dark recesses of the cupboard, pushing aside the soft folds of fur and discovering beyond them a new world. What crunched beneath the feet was not mothballs, but snow. Lucy had discovered Narnia. Millions of readers throughout the world have been thrilled by this moment in C.S. Lewis's story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and have gone on to read the 6 other stories in which he wrote about the other world behind the wardrobe, the world of Narnia. The powerfulness of the stories derives in part from the immediacy of Lewis's rough-hewn style, but more surely from the fact that this image touches something so very deep in so many people. If everyone on Earth were rational, someone remarks in Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, nothing would happen. Nothing much would have appeared to have happened in the life of C.S. Lewis, who for his entire adult life was a scholar and teacher at Oxford and Cambridge in England. He did not mix in the world with famous or fashionable people. His days were filled with writing and reading and domestic chores. And yet books about him continue to pour out from the presses on both sides of the Atlantic. This phenomenon can only be explained by the fact that his writings, while being self-consciously and deliberately at variance with the 20th century, are paradoxically in tune with the needs and concerns of our time. Everything on earth is not rational, and attempts to live by reason have all failed. The world has changed more radically in the last 100 years than in any previous era of history. Old values and certainties have been destroyed. Religions have collapsed. In such a world, a voice which appears to come from the old world and to speak with the old sureness will have an obvious appeal. Lewis's attempts to justify an old-fashioned Christian orthodoxy have made him an internationally celebrated and reassuring figure to those believers who have felt betrayed by the compromises of the mainline Christian churches. Lewis, to the amazement of those who knew him in his lifetime, has become, in the quarter century since he died, something very like a saint in the minds of conservative-minded believers. It is not rational Lewis who made this enormous appeal, the Lewis who lectured on medieval and Renaissance literature with such superb fluency and wide-ranging erudition to generations of English students. It is not the Lewis who plumbed the irrational depths of childhood and religion who speaks to the present generation. Though all Freud's theories about the origins of consciousness may be disavowed, this remains the century of Freud. We have learnt that our lives are profoundly affected by what happens to us when we were very young children, and that wherever we travel in mind or body, we are compelled to repeat or work out the drama of early years. If this were a work of psychoanalysis or literary theory, I should feel compelled to test The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by the theories of the human mind which have been adopted and disregarded by psychoanalysts and philosophers in the last 100 years. But these are not areas which admit of rational inquiry. Even if I were qualified to explore them, and Lewis himself would have been equally anxious to remind us of the whole European philosophical tradition since Plato, which has attempted in the language of metaphysics to account for our sense that we do not belong in this world, that we are pilgrims and strangers here, homesick for another place where one day we shall truly be ourselves. 2 journeys made in the course of my research for this biography have brought home to me more vividly than any others the strange nature of my task. The first was to Belfast in Northern Ireland. For those who are not Irish, their first glimpse of modern Belfast is shock. The first was to Belfast in Northern Ireland. For those who are not Irish, their first glimpse of modern Belfast is a shock. Much of its ancient prosperity, derived from its magnificent shipyards, has gone. There is widespread unemployment and poverty. Walking the streets of the working-class districts of the city, one is confronted by distressing images of human irrationality. Even the curbstones shriek of their religious and political allegiance. Protestant Unionist streets are painted red, white, and blue in praise of the Queen and the Reformation. Catholic nationalist streets are daubed white, green, and orange for Ireland and the Pope. In no place on earth does it seem truer that Christ came to bring no peace but a sword. The post offices and police stations are barricaded like fortresses. There is no prospect here of the rational prevailing. Every week that passes, a bomb explodes or a gun is fired because of ancient atavistic religious prejudice. It would not be the best place in the world to take a non-believer in the hope of persuading him or her that Christianity was a very ennobling belief. But it is a very good place for a Christian to recognize what a small part reason plays in most humans' lives. And it might very well prompt the visitor, and even more the resident, to hope that some form of Christianity could be expounded, which was the agreed and good thing which all Christians hold in common, the set of unchanging and saving beliefs which Lewis named mere Christianity. Driving out of the beleaguered city into the suburbs is immediately to encounter a different, happier world, a prosperous, middle-class place which knows no violence. Big, comfortable houses built to sustain and celebrate the simple happiness of family life. Down one such leafy road, you will find the house built by a Belfast police solicitor named Albert Lewis in 1905. It was in this lumpy Edwardian villa that C.S. Lewis and his brother Warren spent the most crucial period of their lives. Climbing up the small back staircase, I reached a landing on the second floor of the house, and there at the end of the corridor I found the little end room. The boys had escaped from the grown-ups and indulged their childhood games. For Lewis himself, it was not a house with happy memories, for it was here that the catastrophe's life took place. The death of his mother on the 23rd of August 1908, when Lewis was 9 years old. The loss was something which he bottled up within himself, unable to appease it through the emotionally stultifying years of boarding school education in England. In terms of his emotional life, the quest for his lost mother dominated his relations with women. His companion for over 30 years was a woman old enough to be his mother, and when she died it was not long before. Like a Pavlovian dog trained to lacerate his heart with the same emotional experiences, he married a woman whose circumstances were exactly parallel to those of his mother in 1908, a woman dying of cancer, who had 2 small sons. Standing in the little end room, I realized that I was beginning to come in terms with the Lewis phenomenon, and why it had such a hugely popular appeal. I had thought to go here merely in order to soak up the atmosphere. I realized that what Lewis was seeking with such painful earnestness all his life was not to be found in this house, nor had it ever been, for any of the time he had lived there after his mother's death. Without the capacity to develop an ordinary emotional life based on a stable relationship with parents, Lewis was driven back and back into the little end room, further up and further in. It would have been good to see the wardrobe in Belfast, but it was not there. To see that, I journeyed over 3,500 miles to a small liberal arts college in the suburbs of Chicago, Wheaton College, Illinois. Between the 2 journeys, I had spent months reading Lewis and hours talking to those who knew him. An image of what he was actually like as a man was by now vividly clear to me. The reasons why many of his Oxford colleagues had disliked him were obvious. He was argumentative and bullying. His jolly, red, honest face was that of an intellectual bruiser. He was loud, and he could be coarse. He liked what he called man's talk, and he was frequently contemptuous in his remarks about the opposite sex. He was a heavy smoker, 60 cigarettes a day between pipes, and he liked to drink deep, roaring out of his unfashionable views in the Oxford bars. This, the beer and Beowulf, Lewis was understandably uncongenial to those of a different temperament. But I had also learnt that he was a kind and patient teacher, a loyal friend, a magnificently astute and intelligent conversationalist, who had read much and who had the capacity to fire his hearers with longing to read his favourite authors for themselves. Few of his friends had ever heard Lewis allude to his inner life, and even his religion was more to be taken for granted than be aired in conversation. The gatherings of cronies in pubs or college rooms had no feeling of an evangelical prayer group. 2 members of that celebrated group, known as the Inklings, had told me that there was always an air of English embarrassment when the subject of religion cropped up, and that Lewis's activities as a religious broadcaster and writer were not something with which his fellow Christians in the Inklings felt at ease. These men knew almost nothing of the Lewis who had emerged in my reading of private letters and diaries. They knew nothing from him of his childhood trauma, little of his too great emotional attachments to women, and next to nothing of his spiritual journey, even though one of these men, Hugo Dyson, had been responsible in part for persuading Lewis to abandon atheism and become a Christian. C.S. Lewis, the popular Christian apologist, who was reaching so many readers in Europe and the United States, was a phenomenon who had a life of his own in the minds of the reading public. C.S. Lewis, the popular Christian apologist who was reaching so many readers in Europe and the United States, was a phenomenon who had a life of his own in the minds of the reading public. His friends did not know that his activity had generated an enormous band of admirers and inquirers, who wrote to Lewis from every corner of the globe and could be sure of getting a written reply. Lewis did not ask to become a cult figure, but by his writing so faithfully to his correspondents, he allowed the cult to build up. For many, including the pen friend he eventually married, the author of the Screwtape Letters and Mere Christianity was a guru or spiritual master who might be expected to provide the answers to life problems. That is not the title of one of Lewis's books. It is the title of a book by Dr. Billy Graham, the most famous alumnus of Wheaton College, Illinois. As you approach the college, you see on your left an enormous Greek revival building known as a Billy Graham Center, built in honor of the famous evangelist. It is hard to imagine Billy Graham enjoying C.S. Lewis's company at any length, though I believe the two met during one of Dr. Graham's crusades in England. Lewis was impatient with Puritanism and disliked non-smokers or teetotalers. He liked to talk of books, and he would have not shared any of Dr. Graham's political enthusiasms. But the wardrobe from the Little Lee has come to response at Wheaton College, Illinois. The Mary E. Wade Center, on the upper floor of the college library, is devoted to the memorabilia of various Christian writers: George MacDonald, T.S. Eliot, Dorothy L. Sayers, Charles Williams, J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and his brother Warren. The library has also recently acquired the papers of that veteran journalist and cynic Malcolm Muggeridge, and here the faithful may see Muggeridge's portable typewriter kept, like the body of Lenin, in a glass case. A portrait of C.S. Lewis, painted by T.M. Williams, smiles down in the reading room. It is the same glowing unreality as pious paintings of Therese of Lisieux or the Sacred Heart adorning convent walls in days now gone. Hard by, in a glass display cabinet, are Lewis's beer tankards and pipes, which in his abstemious atmosphere seem out of place. I worked at the table which, a brass plate informed me, had been in Lewis's college room at Magdalen and subsequently in the dining room at his house at Oxford. The Kilns, Dorothy L. Sayers, and T.S. Eliot, and many other famous people, it was claimed, had used this table. I had been reading Lewis, and talking to those who had known him, for the better part of 20 years, and doing serious research into his life for 2 years. I had come across no possible occasion when T.S. Eliot, with whom Lewis did not enjoy cordial relations, would have used this table. What does it matter? The same sort of rationalist objections could be made about supposed relics of the true cross. A piece of furniture stood in the corner of the room, carved by Lewis's grandfather. It was the wardrobe. At Wheaton, one had stepped through the wardrobe into the world of the make-believe. Not long before my visit to Wheaton, a book by Catherine Linskog had been drawn to my attention entitled The C.S. Lewis Hoax. It was published in Oregon in 1988, and it makes disturbing reading. Since its central thesis has been disproved, I imagined that it would not be published in Great Britain, though it was bought by a British publisher at Frankfurt Book Fair in 1988. Linskog claims that one of Lewis's feebler posthumous works, a semi-obscene piece of science fiction called The Dark Tower, a continuation of his space trilogy, was not in fact the work of Lewis at all, but a forgery by someone else. A manuscript of this depressing fragment is deposited in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and experts have made it clear beyond doubt that it is written in Lewis's hand. Nevertheless, Linskog's book is concerned with a much wider issue than the authorship of The Dark Tower. It amounts to one of the most vitriolic personal attacks on a fellow scholar, Walter Hooper, that I've ever read in print. As Elia W. Dorset, the curator of the Mary E. Wade Center, concedes, Linskog has gone too far in her assaults on Hooper's good name. Her notions of a forged Dark Tower are mistaken, and some of her other assertions, for example, that the title given by Hooper to Lewis's letters to Arthur Greeves, They Stand Together, is a piece of pedrastic argot, are wide of the mark. For those of us who have known Hooper for a very long time, however, there are moments in Linskog's diatribe where we recognize bits of truth. Hooper does, as Linskog asserts, like people to believe that he knew Lewis much better and much longer than was really the case. The details of Linskog's books are unimportant to the general reader. What strikes an outsider is how violently the C.S. Lewis devotees seem to dislike one another. From very early days, there has been a great schism in their camp. It is notoriously difficult for those outside the borders of a religious dispute to describe with accuracy the sticking points involved, and if I attempted a detailed analysis of Lewis's feuds, I should probably fall into as many errors as if I were attempted a discourse on the difference between Shiite and Sunni Muslims. Some of the quarrels had to do with the holdings of Lewis's manuscripts. Walter Hooper, an American resident in Oxford, was anxious that a complete Lewis's collection, either in original manuscript form or in a microfiche, should be available to scholars in Bodleian Library. The late Clyde S. Kilby, who was largely responsible for building up the Lewis collection at Wheaton, agreed to a proposal that there should be a free exchange between Wheaton and the Bodleian until a dispute arose about some letters. Then all smiles stopped together. Walter Hooper, who had the task of editing most of posthumous works and working directly with Lewis's estate and publishers, had come in for the brunt of criticism from his fellow countrymen back across the water. But over the years, it has become clear that the quarrels are not merely about Hooper's own role in Lewis's life or about the ownership of various bits of paper. Two totally different Lewises are being revered by the faithful, and it is this which makes the dispute so painfully acrimonious. Hooper was, for many years, an extreme Anglo-Catholic priest, but has subsequently become a Roman Catholic. He presides over weekly meetings of the C.S. Lewis Society in Oxford, where papers are read and discussions held by interested parties, mainly students. It is not an exclusively high church group, but there is a distinctly Catholic bias in Hooper's interpretation of Lewis, which not everyone who knew the man would find completely believable. Most notably peculiar in Hooper's picture of his hero is his belief in the perpetual virginity of C.S. Lewis. There is very direct evidence, both from Lewis's brother-in-law, Dr. David Mann, and from Lewis's own pen, that Lewis was not a virgin, and that his marriage was consummated. It would be amazing, though no evidence is forthcoming either way, if Lewis's 30-year relationship with Miss Moore was entirely asexual. Ordinary biographical criteria, however, are not allowed by Hooper to apply, since for him, Lewis has become a sort of Catholic saint. And one can hardly believe in a Catholic saint, both of whose sexual relations were with women who had husbands still living. Therefore, when Lewis wrote in A Grief Observed that he and his wife were lovers, that they had fallen in love, and that noble hunger, long unsatisfied, met at last its proper food, that she was his mistress, that we were one flesh, that no cranny of heart or body remained unsatisfied, that he was in fact writing a work of fiction. Hooper has a natural bent for hero worship, and because he believes celibacy to be a high virtue, he cannot believe that Lewis and his wife were, as the man himself wrote, a sinful woman married to a sinful man. In the United States, among Lewis's Protestant devotees, there is an analogous awkwardness about his passion for alcohol and tobacco. Some of Lewis's American publishers actually asked for references to drinking and smoking to be removed from his work. And one has the strong feeling that this is not so much because they themselves disapprove of the activities, as because they need Lewis, who was against all evidence a non-smoker and lemonade drinker. It is the need which awakens the image, and once the image has been set up and revered, an emotion has been poured into it. There is something profoundly painful about the idea of anyone worshipping a different icon, or threatening to demolish all the icons. Lewis idolatry, like Christianity itself, has resorted to some ugly tactics as it breaks itself into factions. Hard work are used on both sides, and there is not much evidence of Christian charity when the war is at its hottest. In their libraries and periodicals, the differing Lewis factions have conceived for one another an enmity which would do Screwtape proud, and it provides a strange parallel to the sort of unhinged sectarian disputes which have dogged Lewis's native Belfast for the last 60 years. When we step beyond the wardrobe door, we expect battles. Witches and monsters will threaten our subconscious until we reach the longed-for consummation when we change itself, stand still, and Aslan is king forever. A writer who can evoke such reactions is worthy of scrutiny, and scrutiny of a particular kind. When I had seen Belfast and Wheaton, I saw the extent of the problem facing Lewis's biographer. Some time before staying in the south of France with Christopher Tolkien, the son of J.R. Tolkien, I took down from the shelf a copy of Lewis's book, Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. Here was evidence, if any was needed, of how one of Lewis's closest friends reacted to his last works of piety. The book is not about prayer, Tolkien writes in the margin, but about Lewis praying. But, he adds to the flyleaf, the whole book is always interesting. Why? Because it is about Jack by Jack, and that is a topic that no one who knew him well could fail to find interesting even when exasperating. I myself never knew Lewis, though I have known many people who did, and I have never failed to find their memories of the man interesting. Like Tolkien, I am puzzled. Why? In the same marginal note, Tolkien continues, the book is in fact egocentric, by which I do not mean that C.S. Lewis worshipped himself or was a proud or vain man, overesteeming his words or wisdom, but I do mean that it must be the case with anyone who essays autobiography under any form he found C.S.L. an absorbing topic. Lewis was in fact an obsessive autobiographer. Most of his later books are, as Tolkien says, all about himself, and he also wrote copiously on the subject to his many correspondents. Yet few writers have ever been less introspective. This is a paradox. He was not vain, but he had a capacity to project images of himself into prose. Sometimes, one feels, without quite realizing what he was doing, it is these images which have a posthumous staying power. For me, the most attractive, Lewis is the author of English literature in the 16th century, a fluent, highly intelligent man talking about books in a manner which is always engaging. This itself is a self-projection. Reading the book, you feel you know what it is like to hear him talk. This is 10 times true of his religious books, and since many readers will associate Lewis's tone of voice with some of their deepest and most profoundly felt religious moments, there is no wonder that they guard their images of him jealously. Lewis himself, in his own words, that sinful man, wrote in his most devastatingly personal book, A Grief Observed, that all reality is iconoclastic. The earthly beloved, even in this life, incessantly triumphs over your mere idea of her, and you want her too. You want her with all of the resistances, you want her with all her unexpectedness, and that is, in her foursquare, an independent reality. This book is not intended to be iconoclastic, but I will try to be realistic, not only because reality is more interesting than fantasy, but also because we do Lewis no honour to make him a plaster saint, and he deserves our honour. That is the end of the preface. I will see you in chapter 1.